I think about is you.
Welcome back to the John Fredericks Radio Network. Time now 7:08, and on the line with us, Miss Liz Peek. Liz, welcome back to the show with Colonel Mike.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, thank you, Liz. I was going to talk about the EU and NATO, and then we had the hearings. John is he's in Myrtle Beach. He's doing the Little League with the family, and he's just jumping out of his chair that he's not here today. So I'm glad I have you on as a guest. You know how the news cycle works. Liz, what'd you think of yesterday?
I thought it was an embarrassment, and I thought Peter Strzok was an insufferably arrogant twerp.
Oh, he
you
is
can
a
quote
twerp,
me on that.
He is.
But really, the idea that this fellow, who at best is not a particularly laudable character, right? Someone who's carrying on an extramarital affair in the workplace, which, by the way, don't we frown on that?
Yes.
It basically had, stood up the Senate for any number of, the House for any number of weeks and months and refused to cooperate, and then had the temerity to sit there smirking and acting like he was the hero. And unfortunately, for half the country, he is a hero. And the Democrats, I thought, just embarrassed themselves all over the place by cheering him,
Did you hear the Purple
to make
Heart?
sure he didn't answer questions. It was appalling.
Well, you notice their defense was the children on the border, and they were concerned about our allies and the NATO and how Trump is just disrespecting our allies. You know, they were diverting every level, and then that Trump is going to meet Putin. Liz, I want to ask you a question. We never hear from the Democrats about the hacking, the cybersecurity hacking from China on the OPM, on the Office of Personnel Management.
Yeah, one of the worst hacks in the history
One
of
of
the
the worst
country.
hacks. No one did anything about
Yeah.
it. The IRS, Lois Lerner, Lois Lane from Superman, the IRS being weaponized. The Democrats never consider the American citizen like they do about people on the border. And I just told the last caller to the show a little bit ago, I said, I never seen these Democrats run out and go adopt these children. We got so many children in our country in foster care. Dianne Feinstein's got $100 million. Why don't she adopt a few kids?
Look, I think the good news is that the border issue, for the moment, is over. The kids have been reunited with their families. I have to say I thought that was an incredibly stupid gesture to separate families because it clearly was going to become a public relations fiasco, and it did, just like Obama's influx of Central Americans at the border, if you remember, a few years ago, where all of a sudden tens of thousands of people were arriving, and we were completely unprepared, something that everyone agreed was ridiculous because they knew for months that they were coming. This is an ongoing problem, and honestly, there has to be some solution coming out of this White House, because this White House will tackle this problem. But as you well know, and I'm sure your listeners know, the situation today is if you arrive at our border asking for asylum, you are allowed into the country. You basically plead your case before a judge, or eventually you do, but then you are released into the population, and it is a ridiculously small number that ever resurface to actually meet their court date. So, tens of thousands of people are coming into the country illegally every month, and they are basically allowed to stay here. They disappear into the so-called shadows. My view is that, and by the way, some EU countries are beginning to look at this approach, there should be, at our American embassy in Mexico City and our consulates in the big cities of Mexico, way stations for asylum seekers. That's where they should go through the asylum conversation. And guess what? They won't be on American soil. If Mexico finds this onerous because they have a lot of people ending up in Mexico, they can firm up their borders. So there has got to be a way we can confront this. And yes, by the way, a wall would also do the trick, because now there really is no way to prevent people from simply walking into the United States.
And you don't know who's coming in the country, Liz. You don't know who's coming in the country.
No, it's true. And, there is, of course, a middle ground on all of this, which nobody ever talks about. But the real middle ground is, yes, we want immigrants. We want immigrants to come to this country legally, which they have done for hundreds of years. We want them to go through the process, and even Hispanic Americans want them to go through the process
Absolutely.
legally.
I know 7th-generation Hispanic Americans who want to go through the process.
Yeah, I mean, it's partly an issue of fairness, right? I mean, if only some people have to do it and others don't, what's fair about that? Nothing.
Well, you know what you just said, Liz? You can write that in one of your columns, that they should have this, like you say, way stations. You should have it in one of your columns.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I actually think, and as I say, this is an idea that is gaining traction in the EU because, of course, the EU has this gigantic problem, really mainly at the hands of Merkel, Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, who basically opened the doors. And we don't have a problem nearly to the extent that they do, because that's a country of 80 million people, and they let in 1 million people. It was a huge migration. And guess what? Germans don't like it because, excuse me, in these little Bavarian villages, which are so quaint and charming and everything, now you've got a call to prayer 6 times a day or whatever it is, and it's really uncomfortable for the residents of those towns. So they are beginning to look at, yes, we are open to migrants, but we have got to interview them in Libya, or we have to, talk to them someplace before they hit the continent.
Great idea. Great. I agree with you. I couldn't agree more because, years ago I was in Southeast Asia, and when Cambodia was getting special privileges and so on to do trade with us, when we were opening up relations, the Chinese saw that like a door open, and they sent 3,000 Chinese there who got, they bribed the embassy in Cambodia, the Cambodian embassy, and they became Cambodian citizens, which permitted them to come into our country through a backdoor process.
That's very China. They cheat, and we know that on every front, and that doesn't surprise me. But you raise an important point, which is that this is an industry. The people trying to get or trying to smuggle illegals into the country, trying to gain asylum for others, it is an industry. And
it's a big industry.
And the minute we clamp down on it, word travels to Central America and the flow of people stops. So, it is not, and that happened under Obama. Obama all of a sudden got sort of mildly more aggressive about holding the border.
But Liz, how do they get this $5,000?
And guess what? Almost overnight, what was a torrent became a trickle of people into the country. So it's possible. The other thing that Obama did, and we should be doing more of, putting people on planes and sending them home. We do that. If you arrive at JFK without a passport, you're sent on the next plane home. Why can't we do that?
Liz, where do they get this $5,000 to pay these mules? They're making $100 at best a month in Guatemala.
That is a really good question.
Yeah, where do they get this money? Who's financing it? A lot of people say there's people like the Open Society Institute and so on. But I want to get to the EU and NATO with you because I wanted to get your opinion on Donald Trump's performance with NATO and the EU.
Well, as I was reading the latest disruption, which was, as you probably saw, an interview published in, I think it was The Sun in England, about Theresa May and Donald Trump being critical of May and somewhat laudatory of Boris Johnson, who the strong Brexiter who just quit the government. I would say that was a mistake because Theresa May has been someone who has basically stood by Trump most of the time, and I think this was something of an affront. I think probably, frankly, Trump doesn't listen to anybody. He did this interview probably against the advice of his staff, and I think it was a mistake. But in general, I thought the NATO thing was great, and I was thinking this morning, it's only in diplomatic circles that telling the truth is considered bad form. And that's what Trump did, and particularly vis-a-vis this Nord Stream pipeline from Russia to Germany. I've written about this in the past. It is unconscionable that Germany has turned to Russia, which has used its natural gas exports as a political weapon, cutting off the Ukraine twice in the middle of winter, etc., while it could, develop its own natural gas resources or begin to import more LNG from the United States. We are now in contention. as a supplier. We have more than a 100-year supply of natural gas in this country, and only reluctantly did Obama begin to allow us to export energy. He didn't like the energy industry, didn't really want to encourage the growth of the energy industry, but the numbers were just too vast. We had such a surplus of natural gas, it had to go somewhere. It takes time to ramp up. We need to build LNG tankers and terminals and so forth. But why Germany would be, and the corruption angle where the former chancellor is head of the project.
Schroeder.
Pretty unbelievable, right? So
a lot of people didn't know that.
Merkel was embarrassed by all of that, and frankly, I welcome that.
Hey, Liz, a lot of people didn't know about Schroeder till the other day.
Yeah. I didn't know that.
I knew about it. I remember reading about it a long time ago. The other thing is, remember, Germany was big on that wind movement and the solar movement and the wind. And, they don't really have that much sun. You could go to Germany in July and get snow.
Well, let me tell you, Colonel Mike, I begin to quote myself all the time, which is embarrassing. But I wrote about this a few years ago because at a conference I was at, a German politician was making a big point about how they were doing so great on their environmental issues, cutting down on greenhouse gases, et cetera. And then the next speaker, I was so thrilled by this, was an American, and this was pre-Trump, I think it was during Obama's reign, who came on and said, well, yes, that's true, but then German industrial manufacturers are paying 6 times what American companies are for power. Mm-hmm. So I began to dig into that, and here's the story, which I think is hysterically funny. Germany, yes, had this big green, and by the way, Germany and France really have to deal with green parties in a way that we do not in this country. Very strong element in their coalition governments, et cetera. Anyway, their Green Party had insisted on a big move to renewable energy sources, wind and energy, and wind and sun. And as you point out, guess what? The wind doesn't always blow, sun doesn't always shine. So they came up short in terms of power. So what did they do? And meanwhile, they had shut down a lot of nuclear plants, really kind of going all in on the green thing. And they came up short of power and had to basically supply the gap by importing lignite and burning lignite, which is without a doubt the filthiest fuel on the planet. So these brainiacs in Germany had basically undermined not only their own industrial sector by jacking up costs enormously to pay for all this greening of their power sector, but also undermined all environmental aspirations by burning lignite. And by the way, both Germany and France are not meeting their Paris Climate Accord commitments.
Of course not.
It's all fake, it's all pretend.
Yeah.
And no one ever calls them out on those. Frankly, I think it was great that Trump did.
He's like the Hulk. He went there like the Hulk.
Yeah.
He's like, hey, you got to pay. Oh, by the way, it could be, I love when he says to the guy in NATO, you probably owe us $1 trillion.
Yeah, I know. Round numbers. He likes round numbers.
But, he's a developer, and everybody will say to you, but he's not this, and he's not smooth, and he's not, but he's Trump. That's what he is.
That's right.
You get what you see, and you see what you get, and that's him.
And I think Americans are kind of getting used to it. I mean, not the resistance, obviously, but a lot of people across the country, I see like polling that suggests that, they kind of agree with him on NATO. They give him credit for the booming economy. I mean, it is interesting how we are becoming a little inured to all that roughness and tough talk and everything, because at the heart of the day, at the bottom, at the core, always,
he's
he
for
is
America.
Actually making sense.
He's for America.
That's right. But in a constructive way, like
yes.
Lashing out at China. Guess what? That should have happened 20 years ago. I mean, that's a fact. And I could fill your ears for an hour with the things the Chinese have done wrong and done badly.
But the Democrats don't mention it. Yesterday, they're all about the border. They're all of a sudden, they're worried about NATO. If we could save money on NATO, then we could talk about public housing. We could talk about NYCHA in New York. We could talk about children in school. We could talk about more Social Security and money in the Social Security checks. We could do a lot of things, saving money in NATO and the EU. And Trump's right. You guys had a long free ride, and I'm here to just bust up your party. I love it.
Well, I just, maybe the timing is right, but Germany, again, is the country that just kind of gets under my skin because, again, of course, they're paying 1.2% of their GDP for defense, and that's really unconscionable. They're the richest country in Europe, and they have Germany is incredible. If you think America first is Trump's point of view, believe me, Merkel's is Germany first. And whether it's the Iran deal, what did they care? Why did they care about the Iran deal and defend it so hotly?
Of course, money.
Because their companies went there immediately to start building plants and doing
and Turkey
business.
too.
Okay,
Everything
that's
is
legit.
with Turkey. Everything's with Turkey too. They're big
Exactly
partners
right.
with Turkey. Liz Peek, it's always a pleasure. It's 7:24. I know you're going to probably have 25 shows to be on today, or calls to call in, and I know you'll be on a lot of the networks. There's a lot going on in the news. Always, thank you for coming back on the John Fredericks Radio Network.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, and none is more fun than this.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz.
Take
Bye-bye
care.
now.